The first shot took out the lead vehicle's left drive shaft, and Iris Calder was still buckling her harness when the convoy jackknifed sideways across the frost-cracked roadbed, and Dane Marlowe reached across the cabin and put her head below the dash with one open hand, the way another man might close a door. "Stay," he said, and was out of the vehicle before the second shot hit. She heard it more than saw it. 3 flat cracks of energy discharge, a fourth that sounded wetter, wronger, and then nothing from that direction at all. Grit sifted down through the shattered side window and settled in her hair. Somewhere ahead, Ambassador Vasquez was shouting orders into a comm unit that had already stopped answering, and behind her, in the second vehicle, someone was screaming in a register that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up and told her it was Corporal Ash, and that screaming meant he was still alive to do it. Iris counted to 10, because counting was the only thing her hands would agree to do, then lifted her head over the dash. The Ashveil Corridor ran arrow straight between 2 black ridgelines for 11 kilometers, no cover but the convoy itself, and 4 raider trucks had come out of the northern draw in a pattern too clean to be opportunistic. A pattern she would understand only much later, that had needed someone with a schedule to build it. Dane was on the roadbed between the second and third vehicles, not behind cover, not moving in the scrambling half-crouch every training video had taught her to expect from a man under fire. He was walking. He put 2 rounds into the cab of the nearest truck without appearing to aim, and the truck sheared off the road into the ridge wall doing 40 kilometers an hour, and he was already turning toward the second one before the first had finished skidding. "Get the ambassador into the ditch," he said to nobody in particular, in the same flat tone he'd used to ask her to pass the water, and 2 of the compact security detail, men twice his visible bulk in armor plate, obeyed him instantly, the way people obey a voice that has already decided the outcome. It took 90 seconds. Iris would count it later on the recovered convoy timestamp and not believe the number, because 90 seconds had felt, from the floor of that cabin, like the entire remaining length of her life. When it was over, 3 raider trucks burned in the ditch, and the 4th was already a shrinking dust plume back toward the northern draw, and Dane Marlowe stood in the center of the road, reloading a weapon she hadn't known he was carrying, breathing exactly as hard as a man who had just climbed 1 flight of stairs. "Cindral Vanguard markings," he said, when she finally got the door open and her legs remembered how to hold her upright. "Old paint job, new engines. Somebody's been feeding them parts money." "You're not hurt," it came out as an accusation. "No. You just," she gestured at the burning trucks, the dead men inside them, the whole impossible arithmetic of what she'd watched happen in front of her. "You just did that, alone, standing up." "Cover doesn't help against people who can't shoot straight," Dane said, and knelt to check Ash's leg wound with hands that had gone, in the space of 1 breath, from killing efficiency to a gentleness that made her chest hurt in a way she didn't have time to examine. Which these weren't. They wanted a slowed down, not dead. "Somebody's testing the road." 6 weeks earlier, in a briefing room 3 light-years from the Ashveil Corridor, a compact mission liaison had spent 40 minutes telling Iris everything the Terran Relief and Accord mission knew about the Cindral Vanguard, their strength, their grievance, their leader Commander Vray Sakesh, a Velken separatist who had fought the last war and lost a brother to it, and never once in 9 years since accepted that the peace which followed was worth what it cost. She had studied maps of the corridor. She had memorized checkpoint protocols and the correct honorific forms for addressing a Velken magistrate, and the 6 specific ways a treaty negotiation could collapse before either side ever raised a weapon. Nobody in that briefing room had spent more than 90 seconds on the man assigned to drive her through hostile territory, because the mission's logistics office had filed Dane Marlowe under security, contracted, local registry, and moved on to the next line item. And Iris, 25 years old and 3 weeks into the most important posting of her career, had not thought to ask why a contracted driver's file came, stamped, with a Cairn colonial registry seal, instead of a compact service record. She thought about it now, watching him lift Ash onto a stretcher board as though the man weighed nothing at all. Iris had grown up 1,100 kilometers from where she now stood, in a Terran border settlement called Meridian Hollow that no current map bothered printing, because the fighting that predated the Cindral Vanguard by a full decade had erased it before she turned 15. She remembered the shape of the town, the way people remember dreams they've decided not to examine too closely. The water plant her mother managed, the schoolhouse with the cracked observation dome, the particular gray-green color the hills went in the season before the evacuation order finally came. She remembered her mother staying 2 extra days after the order to keep the plant running for the families who hadn't gotten transport passes yet. And she remembered, with a clarity 6 years had done nothing to dull, the specific silence a comm channel makes when the person on the other end has stopped being able to answer it. She had been 14, waiting at a relief depot 4 systems away, when a compact casualty officer read her mother's name off a list in the same even voice he'd used for the 11 names before it, and she had spent the 2 years afterward learning, the slow and useless way grief teaches anyone, that there had been no single villain in Meridian Hollow's ending. No raider commander had ordered the water plant destroyed. No magistrate had signed an order condemning it. It had simply been a place too small and too far from any negotiating table to matter to anyone whose decisions could have saved it, ground down by a war both sides claimed, afterward, they had been trying to end. She had applied to the Compact Relief and Accord mission the year she turned 21, against the advice of an uncle who thought she was walking straight back into the fire that had taken her mother, and every review board since had asked her some version of the same question. Why choose a career spent across a negotiating table from the people whose war had done this to her? And she had never given any of them the honest answer. The honest answer was that she had decided, somewhere in those 2 years, that the failure which killed her mother had not been a Velken failure or a Terran one. It had been a failure of somebody, in some room very like this one, not doing the unglamorous, patient work of making a piece hold before the shooting started again. She meant to be the somebody who did that work, and she had built her entire adult life around the belief that it was possible, 1 clause and 1 convoy and 1 exhausted negotiation at a time. She did not tell Dane any of this on the corridor, with Ash still bleeding into a field dressing and Vasquez's voice going thin with the specific fear of a man realizing his risk assessment had been wrong. But she thought of the schoolhouse dome and the 2 extra days, every time the convoy passed a scorched terrace or a garrison flying colors that had once flown over a town that no longer existed on any chart. And the thought did something fear alone never managed. It steadied her hands. Ambassador Corin Vasquez had a laceration above his eye that wouldn't stop bleeding, and a voice that had gone thin with the particular fear of a career diplomat realizing, 20 years into a posting that had never before put him within 100 kilometers of live fire, that the numbers in his risk assessments had been wrong. He gripped Iris's wrist hard enough to bruise. "Comrades dead," he said, "both units. We can't reach the waypoint. We can't reach the mission house. And in 4 days Magistrate Thane opens the hollow accord whether we're standing in front of her or not." "Then we drive," Iris said, and heard herself say it, and felt the shape of the sentence settle into her like a decision she hadn't fully made yet but couldn't now take back. "You drive. I can't." Vasquez pressed a cloth to his eye, and something in his face when he looked at her was an apology and an abdication both at once. "I'm not steady enough to sit across a table from a Velken first magistrate, and I know it. You've read every page of this accord twice over. You finished the crossing. I'll relay what I can from here, once the technicians get a field unit working." It was, Iris understood with the strange clarity of shock still not fully worn off, a battlefield promotion delivered by a man too injured to notice he'd made one, and there was no time to argue with it, because Dane was already at her shoulder saying, they had 11 hours of daylight left and 90 kilometers of corridor still ahead of them, and the wrecked trucks would draw whoever sent them back within the hour to see what had gone wrong. 3 trucks, she said to him low, while the detail loaded the wounded. Sakash's people knew exactly where to hit us. This road isn't on any public register. No, Dane agreed. It isn't. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud, but she watched him file the thought away behind his eyes exactly the way she was filing it away behind hers, and understood, with a small cold certainty that had nothing to do with the raiders now burning in the ditch behind them, that somewhere between the mission house and this stretch of frozen road, someone had made a phone call they shouldn't have been able to make. The Ashveil Corridor climbed for 6 hours through switchback grades where the wind came sideways off the ridge, and the frost-cracked stone gave way, eventually, to the smoother black basalt of settled Velken territory. And Iris spent most of it not sleeping, watching Dane's hands on the wheel, and trying to reconcile the file she'd read, contracted local driver, no notable service history, day rate low enough that the mission's procurement office had approved it without a second signature. Against the man who had walked into gunfire like weather. Cairn Registry, she said finally, when the silence had stretched past the point of politeness. That's a Deathworld colony seal. I looked it up after the ambush. There isn't a public record of what selection standards they use out there. There isn't a public record because nobody outside Cairn wants one. Dane didn't look away from the road. Compact treaties with 3 separate polities in this sector cap Deathworld-trained combat personnel at 0, officially. Which means every mission that quietly hires a Cairn-marked contractor does it through logistics, not security, and pays a driver's wage for a soldier's work. And nobody asks questions because asking questions means admitting the cap gets broken every time a mission actually needs somebody who can survive contact. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters for the next 4 days. He glanced at her once, and there was something almost gentle underneath the flatness of it. You've got a treaty to save and a man to keep alive back at that garrison. Rule 1, the principle doesn't wait on things that don't change the outcome. Whatever I am isn't going to change between here and the waypoint. Whether we make it there in time might. You have rules. 3 of them. A muscle moved at his jaw that might on another man have been the beginning of a smile. Rule 2, nobody touches the principle but me. Rule 3, I don't explain myself twice. You've had Rule 1 and most of Rule 3 already. Don't waste Rule 2 finding out the hard way. She let it sit, because he was right about the math even if he dodged the actual question, and because some small unexamined part of her recognized, watching the black ridgeline slide by outside the window, that whatever fear the ambush should have left in her had been quietly and thoroughly replaced by something else. Not safety exactly, but the specific, dangerous comfort of being in a vehicle driven by a man who did not appear to know how to lose. They stopped an hour outside Senir Hold, at a mixed settlement called Rennick's Landing that had grown up around a compact relief depot in the 6 years since the last ceasefire, because Vasquez needed a proper field dressing changed, and the convoy needed fuel neither vehicle could reach the garrison without. It was the first place since the ambush where Iris saw ordinary people, Terran relief workers, Velken families who had drifted south when their own border towns emptied, a scatter of children too young to remember the war clearly enough to be afraid of the convoy's compact markings. And it was the first place she understood, watching them, exactly how much weight the treaty she was carrying actually held for people who would never sit in the hollow Waypoint's amphitheater to see it signed. An elderly Velken woman named Yerith, whose vents had gone the pale mottled color Iris's collar, rendered as grief-worn thin by years of carrying it, found her near the fuel depot and would not be moved along by the security detail's polite insistence that the delegation was on a schedule. "You are the one going to speak to Thane," Yerith said. It wasn't a question. Tell her Rennick's Landing does not care whose fault the last war was. Tell her we have buried it under enough new graves on both sides that the fault stopped mattering somewhere around the 3rd year. Tell her we want the accord signed even if it is imperfect, even if Orani's Val and every hardliner like him hate every clause of it, because imperfect peace has fed my grandchildren for 6 years and perfect war fed nobody at all. Her undervoice, when it caught at the end of the sentence, dropped into a harmonic register. Iris didn't need a collar's help to translate. A Terran relief coordinator named Priya Anand, 20 years into a career Iris hoped, privately, her own would someday resemble, pulled her aside near the depot's loading dock with a grimmer accounting. Cindral recruiters have been through here twice this season, Anand said, low, glancing toward a cluster of Velken teenagers unloading crates who were, Iris understood only after a beat, exactly the age Sakash's raiding parties preferred. Not with weapons. With money, and with a story about how the Hollow Accord sells out every border family for a peace that only protects the capital worlds. Every day this crossing takes longer than it should. That story gets easier to believe. It was in the depot yard, 20 minutes later, that a Velken child, small enough that her chitin hadn't yet begun to harden past the soft juvenile plates along her arms, broke from her mother's grip and ran straight at Iris with the fearless directness only very young children managed around strangers, delighted by the bright compact insignia on Iris's coat. And Dane crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and went to one knee in front of the girl instead of pulling Iris back. Blocking nothing, threatening nothing, simply putting his own larger body at the child's eye level so her mother had a clean half-second to close the gap without anyone startling. "She's fine," he said to the mother, whose vents had flared a panicked white before she reached them. "Just curious, no harm done." The mother's undervoice, once she gathered her daughter up, carried something Iris hadn't expected to hear directed at Dane in a Velken settlement this close to the war's old front line. Not fear, not the wary calculation Osset would show at the checkpoint ahead, but a kind of startled, grateful recognition. The sound, Iris understood only much later, of someone realizing that the same stillness that made a man devastating in a firefight also made him, without any visible effort at all, safe to put a child down in front of. "Everybody in Rennick's Landing has an opinion about whether this treaty survives the week," Dane said, once they were back on the road. "Senior holds black walls just visible on the horizon. Not one of them mentioned me. That's the job working the way it's supposed to." "For now," Iris said, and did not yet know how true that warning would turn out to be. The checkpoint at Senior Hold sat where the corridor met the first paved Velken highway, a squat garrison of black stone and cold white light manned by a dozen soldiers whose faceted eyes tracked the convoy's approach with the unhurried thoroughness of people who had already decided, before the vehicles stopped, exactly how this encounter would go. Their commanding officer introduced herself as Warden Ale Osset, and she did not offer a hand, because Velken did not touch strangers, and she did not smile, because Velken faces did not make that particular shape, but she looked at the scorch marks still visible on the lead vehicle's flank and her undervoice. The low harmonic hum every Velken carried beneath their spoken register, audible through a properly tuned translator collar, dropped half a tone in a way Iris's training had taught her to read as genuine alarm. "Cindral markings," Osset said, "on the open corridor, in daylight." Her throat vents flickered pale silver, the Velken tell for controlled surprise. "They have not struck this deep into secured territory in 4 years. 4 trucks," Iris said. "We destroyed 3. The 4th ran north." "You destroyed 3. Osset's faceted gaze went past Iris entirely, to Dane, standing a half-pace back in the posture of a man doing nothing at all except being present, and her undervoice caught not a full drop, just a hitch, a half-second of harmonic static that the collar rendered as a faint digital stutter, the particular sound, Iris would learn only later to recognize, of a trained listener hearing something she didn't have a category for. One driver did this. "He's contracted security," Iris said, before Dane could answer for himself, because something in her had already decided, without quite deciding it consciously, that the fewer sentences Dane Marlowe spoke inside a Velken garrison, the safer this crossing would be. Terran Compact Registry, standard escort duty. Osset studied him for 3 full seconds, long enough that Iris felt the silence turn into its own kind of pressure, and then her vents settled back to their resting gray, and she gestured them through the gate with the brisk economy of a soldier who had decided that whatever question she'd almost asked wasn't hers to answer. "First Magistrate Thane has been informed of the ambush," Osset said, falling into step beside Iris as the convoy rolled through into the garrison yard. "She wished me to convey that the Hollow Accord opens in 3 days regardless of the corridor's condition, and that she personally requests you arrive whole." A pause, her vents flickering a color Iris's collar rendered as something between formal courtesy and private unease. "Second Magistrate Val requests the opposite, in substance if not in wording. He has been arguing since the treaty's first draft that Terran presence in the border territories destabilizes more than it secures. An ambush on the corridor will not improve his opinion, however little it had to do with your mission's own conduct. Second Magistrate Val sits on the Accord Council. Second Magistrate Val chairs the Border Security Subcommittee that will review every clause of the Accord before First Magistrate Thane's signature makes it binding." Osset's undervoice held level, careful, a soldier declining to editorialize about a superior. "He lost a brother in the last war, in the Ashveil fighting specifically. He does not hide that this colors his judgment. He would say it sharpens it." Iris filed the name away next to the memory of a 4th truck running clean and unpursued back toward the northern draw, and did not yet have enough thread to connect them, only the beginning instinct, the same instinct that had made her keep Osset from hearing too much about Dane, that somewhere in the space between a border security hardliner who wanted the treaty dead and raiders who had known exactly which unlisted road to hit, there was a line worth pulling. Senior holds second in command, a broad, scarred garrison veteran named Commander Isildan, made no attempt to hide his skepticism when Warden Osset briefed him on the convoy's account of the ambush that evening, and he did not lower his voice to keep the Terran delegation from hearing it. "One driver," Dan said, arms crossed over a chest plate still bearing dents from actions Iris didn't recognize the campaign markings for. 3 trucks destroyed, no Terran casualties beyond the corporal's leg, and a garrison officer's helmet footage that reads more like a training simulation than an actual engagement. Forgive me if I want a second confirmation before I write that account into this garrison's own defense planning." "The footage is unedited, Commander," Osset said, an edge of formality in her undervoice that Iris read correctly, as a warning Dan chose not to heed. "Unedited footage still needs interpreting. And I have interpreted a great many convoy reports in 30 years of border service that turned out, on closer study, to have left out the part where the convoy's own security detail did most of the actual work, and a contracted driver's reputation grew in the retelling, because reputations are cheaper to build than truth is to verify." Dan's faceted eyes found Iris across the mess hall, not unkindly, but with the flat professional doubt of a soldier who had built a career on not taking convoy accounts at face value. "No offense intended, Liaison Calder. I have simply buried too many officers who believed a story before they'd tested it." "Test it then," Iris said, meeting his gaze without flinching, because 3 weeks of watching diplomats fold under exactly this kind of pressure had taught her precisely what folding looked like, and she had decided, somewhere between the ambush and this mess hall, that she was done doing it. "Commander Sakash himself led the second wave that hit us on the corridor if the pattern holds, and it will hold within 2 more days of travel. You'll have your second confirmation, in person, on your own garrison sensors, and I'd rather you see it happen than take my word or Kers's footage for it." Dan held her look a moment longer, and something in his scarred, doubtful face shifted by a degree too small to name, but real enough that Ossett noticed it too. "You didn't flinch from that," he said. "Most liaisons I've briefed would have." "Most liaisons haven't already watched it happen once," Iris said, and let that be the whole of her answer. And Dan, after a moment, gave the smallest possible nod a man built like a bulkhead could give and returned to his post without further argument, though Iris noticed, over the following hour, that he found several reasons to walk past the corner where Dane sat, watching him with the particular attention of a skeptic quietly gathering his own data. Senior Hold's mess hall was a low stone room warmed by ducted geothermal vents, and the garrison staff had set aside a corner of it for the Terran delegation with the brisk, faintly suspicious courtesy of soldiers who had been ordered to be hospitable and intended to follow the order to the letter and no further. Iris ate standing, going through her copy of the Accord's Border Security Annex for the third time, and Dane sat across from her at the narrow table with a bowl of ration stew he hadn't touched. Watching the mess hall's single door the way she was coming to understand, he watched every door in every room he entered, as a problem to be solved rather than a piece of furniture. "You said Cairn caps Deathworld combat registry at 0 across 3 treaties," Iris said, setting the annex down because her eyes had stopped focusing on it an hour ago. "What actually happens there, on Cairn, to make someone into," she gestured, not quite finding the word, "what you are?" Dane was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all, which had become, over 3 weeks of working alongside him, its own kind of answer. "Cairn's gravity runs 1.4 standard," he said finally. "Doesn't sound like much until you've carried a wounded man across 4 kilometers of broken ground under it. Ridgeback worms hunt in the low country in packs that coordinate better than most military units I've since worked alongside, and the flora past the settlement line will put toxin into an open cut faster than most fielded antitoxins can counter it. The colony's founding charter, it's 300 years old, a penal settlement originally, debts nobody back on the core worlds wanted to forgive any other way, requires every child to pass a survival rite at 16. 2 weeks alone in the low country. Most who go don't come back. The ones who do get marked." He turned one hand over, showing her, for the first time, the faint raised scar tissue along his forearm that she'd noticed on the first day and assumed, wrongly, was an old injury rather than a deliberate ritual pattern. "That's Rule 1, before I ever had rules of my own. Cairn doesn't teach you not to die. It teaches you that dying is always on the table, every single day, and asks whether you're going to let that fact make you careless or precise. Everybody who survives the right picks precise. The ones who pick careless don't survive long enough to have an opinion about it. That's not an education, that's a filter." "It's both." He said it without self-pity, the same flat register he used for everything, but something underneath it had gone quieter than she'd heard from him before. "Compact recruiters have been coming to Cairn for 4 generations, because a filter that lethal produces exactly the kind of soldier every treaty in this sector is too squeamish to admit it needs, and too dependent on to actually refuse. We get hired. We get paid a driver's wage under a logistics line item, because paying us a soldier's wage means admitting on the record that the Accord's own security architecture can't survive without the thing it claims to ban. Nobody at Cairn asks the Compact to fix that. We just get very good at being underestimated, because underestimation on Cairn is the same skill as staying alive. You learn not to waste movement. You learn not to waste words. You learn that the man everyone in the room has already decided is furniture, is the only one still standing when the room stops being safe. Do you resent it? I used to. He looked at her and there was nothing performed in it, no rehearsed diplomat's calibration, just a plain and total honesty that she understood somehow he did not offer often. 3 weeks ago I'd have told you the resentment burned out somewhere around my second contract, that it's just the job now. It isn't entirely. Watching Osset's undervoice hitch when she looked at me back at that gate, that's still the sound of somebody deciding, in real time, whether I'm a person or a weapon they're grateful is currently pointed the right direction. I don't think that stops mattering just because I've gotten good at not showing it. Iris didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud, so she didn't try to construct one, and instead pushed the untouched bowl of stew an inch closer to his side of the table, and after a moment, watching her rather than the door for the first time all evening, Dane picked up the spoon. That night, in a garrison bunk room lit by cold Velken lumen strips, Dane found the poison before it found anyone. It was in the ration crates the garrison had provided for the remaining leg of the crossing, a compound with no smell Iris's collar could translate, dusted along the inner seam of 3 separate containers in a quantity calculated, Dane said, turning one crate over in the light, to sicken without killing, to put half the convoy on its back with cramping, and fever 12 hours into hostile territory with no medic and no comm array. Same signature as the ambush, he said. Somebody wants this convoy slowed, not stopped. A dead Terran delegation is an act of war Sakash's people don't actually want. It hands First Magistrate Thane every justification she needs to crush the Cindral outright, and separatists know it. A crippled, humiliated delegation that limps into the waypoint 3 days late, having lost half its security detail to random misfortune along the way, that's different. That's a story that writes itself into the treaty's failure without anybody having to fire the shot that kills it. Sakash isn't planning to stop the treaty, Iris said slowly, turning the logic over the way she'd turn over a disputed clause. He's planning to make it look like it stopped itself. Or somebody's using him to do exactly that, and he doesn't know it. Dane set the crate down and looked at her with an attention that felt, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely undivided. Raiders who wanted a war would have hit us with everything they had on the corridor and finished it. Whoever built that ambush wanted casualties, not extermination. That's not how you fight a war you actually intend to win. That's how you fight a war you're being paid to keep small. She thought of Osset's careful undervoice describing Second Magistrate Val, a man who had lost a brother to this exact stretch of road, and had spent 9 years arguing that the peace built over his grave wasn't worth what it cost, and said nothing yet, because it was a thin thread and she had learned, in 3 weeks of watching career diplomats destroy themselves on thinner ones, not to pull before she had a second point to anchor it against. They found the second point 4 kilometers past the garrison gate, where the highway forked, and the convoy's route log, pulled up on the dash display while Dane drove and Iris cross-checked it against the paper itinerary the mission house had issued before departure, showed a routing amendment filed 9 hours before the ambush, rerouting the convoy off the main highway and onto the unlisted corridor spur specifically to avoid a reported rockslide that, when Iris queried the garrison's own geological survey feed, had never actually occurred. Someone inside the mission filed that amendment, she said, staring at the timestamp until the numbers blurred. Or someone with mission-level routing access. That's not something Sakash's people could pull from outside. That's an internal Terran authorization code. Or a Velken one, Dane said. Routing amendments on a joint security corridor need sign-off from both sides. Somebody Velken countersigned that reroute too. Find out who, and you've got your second name. They stopped for 4 hours rest at a relay way station called Core's Bridge, a skeletal structure of scaffold and solar collectors spanning a frozen ravine, too small to garrison properly and too exposed to skip. And it was there, in the dead hour before dawn, that Commander Sakash's people tried a different approach entirely. Iris woke to a hand over her mouth that was not rough, exactly, but absolutely immovable, and a voice close to her ear saying, "Don't move, don't speak. There's a blade against the wall panel 18 centimeters from your head and it isn't mine." And it took her a full 3 seconds of pure animal panic to recognize the voice as Dane's, and another 2 to understand that he was not the danger in the room. He was between her and it. The wall panel behind her bunk, a maintenance access meant for the way station's solar relay wiring, had been cut through with a thin, near-silent tool sometime in the last 10 minutes, the edges of the cut still faintly warm when Dane's hand found them in the dark, and on the other side of it, in the narrow service crawlspace that ran the length of the structure, 2 Cindral operatives had come within a single panel's thickness of reaching her before the vibration of the cutting tool's final pass woke the man sleeping, by design, in the cot nearest the wall. "Rule 2, Dane said, so quietly it was barely more than breath, and moved. What happened in the crawlspace took less than 40 seconds and produced almost no sound at all, no gunfire. Because gunfire in a structure with exposed pressure seals over a 100-meter drop was a way to kill everyone in the way station, including the target the operatives had been sent to take alive, which told Iris, once she'd had time to think about it, more about the mission's actual intent than anything else that had happened on the crossing. Sakash's people hadn't come to kill her. They had come to take her, which meant somebody wanted a hostage, not a casualty, and a hostage was a different kind of leverage entirely. One that could stall a treaty signing indefinitely, one that didn't require an act of war anyone had to answer for in the open. Dane came back through the cut panel with a Cindral fighting knife that wasn't his and a graze along one forearm that he wrapped in field gauze without comment, and the 2 operatives who had tried to come through the wall did not come back out the way they'd gone in. "They knew which bunk was mine," Iris said, once her hands had stopped shaking enough to be useful for anything, sitting wrapped in a thermal blanket while the way station's skeleton crew scrambled to seal the breach and raise the alarm to Cindral hold. "Not the ambassador's, not yours. Mine specifically, out of everyone on this convoy. Somebody gave them a manifest with bunk assignments on it." Dane's voice had gone flatter than she'd heard it since the first ambush, which she was learning by now to read as the specific stillness he wore when he was genuinely angry and had decided anger wasn't useful yet. "That's not something raiders pull off an unlisted road map. That's mission-level logistics data, or Velken garrison assignment data, and either way it's the same hand that's been feeding Sakash everything else. A hostage doesn't stall a treaty the way a dead delegation would. It buys time. Weeks maybe, while both sides negotiate a release." Iris made herself say the rest of it out loud, because saying it out loud was the only way she'd learned, in 3 weeks of this posting, to keep a fear from growing larger in the dark than it deserved to be in daylight. Weeks is exactly how long a border security review needs to find real grounds to delay ratification. Weeks is what Vol said he wanted, back at Cindral hold, before I even had a name to put to the wanting. "I can't prove Vol ordered this specific attempt," Dane said. "I can prove somebody with access to your bunk assignment wanted you gone from this convoy quietly enough that nobody had to explain a body." He looked at her, and something in the look was harder than anything he'd shown her yet, harder than the wreckage on the corridor. "Rule 2 doesn't have an exception for clever. Whoever sent those 2 is going to learn that the hard way if they try it again." Officer Kers arrived from Cindral hold with a relief patrol 2 hours later, took one look at the cut panel and the blood on the crawlspace decking, and said something in rapid under-register to her own second-in-command, that the collar rendered only partially, something about a report she intended to file personally and directly to the first magistrate's office rather than through the chain that had, twice now, delivered sensitive convoy details into Cindral hands before the convoy itself had finished making the decisions those details described. "I do not know yet who is leaking your mission's routing and manifests," Kers said to Iris quietly while the relief patrol worked. "I intend to find out before you reach the waypoint. Whatever else is true about this crossing, Calder, it should not have been this easy for anyone to nearly take you out of it." Iris didn't sleep that night either, working the mission's authorization logs by lumen strip light while Dane sat by the door with his weapon across his knees and did not, as far as she could tell, sleep at all, and somewhere past the 4th hour she found the countersignature. A border security office authorization, filed under a delegated credential that traced, 3 layers down through a chain of routine approvals nobody had bothered to scrutinize because nobody expected to need to. Back to 2nd, Magistrate Orini's Val's own subcommittee. She didn't tell Vasquez, whose comm still wasn't working and whose eye wound had gone from bandaged to infected overnight in a way that made Iris's stomach twist with a fear that had nothing to do with treaties. She told Dane, in the gray hour before the convoy moved out, watching his face for some flicker of vindication, and finding only the same still attention he'd given the poisoned crates. "That's not proof," he said. "That's a thread. Val's subcommittee has 40 staff with delegated authority. Could be him. Could be somebody on his staff acting on their own grievance and using his name as cover. Could be somebody outside his office who compromised the credential entirely." He met her eyes. "You want to accuse a sitting magistrate of treason in front of a first magistrate he served under for 11 years. You'd better walk in with more than a routing log." "Then I'll get more." "Then you'll get more," he agreed, "and I'll keep you alive long enough to use it." The second attack came on the 3rd day, 40 kilometers short of the hollow waypoint, where the highway ran low between cultivated terraces and the cover was worse than the open corridor had ever been. And this time there were 9 trucks instead of 4. And this time, Iris understood within the first 30 seconds, Commander Vray Sakash himself had come to see the job finished. She knew him by the way the other raiders moved around him. The deference, the way 3 trucks peeled off from the main group at a hand signal instead of a shouted order. And she watched, from the floor of the command vehicle with a weapon Vasquez had pressed into her hands 2 days ago, and that she had not, until this moment, believed she would ever actually need to fire. As Dane Marlowe stepped out into open ground for the 2nd time in 3 days, and did something that made even the convoy's own security detail go still. He did not walk this time. He moved the way water moves down a grade it has already memorized, and the raiders, 9 trucks, easily 30 armed men, Cindral Vanguard veterans who had fought a real war and survived it, could not find a rhythm against him that lasted longer than the time it took him to close the distance. A Velken escort officer named Kers, assigned to the convoy at Senir Hold, would say afterward, in a report that eventually reached First Magistrate Thane's own desk, that she had counted 11 men down in the first 2 minutes and stopped counting because the number had begun to feel less like tactics and more like a natural law being demonstrated for her benefit. Sakash broke first, not out of cowardice. Iris understood later, watching the footage recovered from Kers's helmet recorder, but out of the particular calculation of a commander who has just watched his estimate of the enemy's capability revise itself in real time and knows, faster than his own men do, when a fight has stopped being winnable. He pulled back with what remained of his force, 6 trucks instead of 9, and Dane let him go, standing in the wreckage of the ambush with blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own and his breathing, again, no harder than a man who'd climbed 1 flight of stairs. "He'll be back," Dane said, when Iris reached him, her hands shaking around a weapon she hadn't had to use, grateful and ashamed of the gratitude in equal measure. "Not because he wants to. Because somebody's paying him to keep trying, and men like Sakash don't quit a debt of honor even when the math has already told them they've lost it." Officer Kers had not moved from where she stood, 10 meters off, watching Dane with an expression Iris's collar rendered, unhelpfully, as simply alarmed. The actual shape of it, faceted eyes wide, undervoice a rapid, uneven flutter, was something closer to a soldier recognizing, for the first time in her career, what an unrestrained Deathworld combatant actually looked like in the open, after a professional lifetime of hearing the phrase used as a slur against cheap contracted labor. "Cairn marked," Kers said very quietly to no one. "I read the intake reports. I did not believe them." Ambassador Vasquez's fever broke into full infection somewhere on the road toward the second ambush site, and by the time the convoy's medic, a young Terran corpsman named Ruiz, promoted by circumstance to the delegation's only remaining medical authority, got a proper look at the wound above his eye, the infection had crossed into territory that made her stop being careful about hiding her concern. "It needs a real surgical suite, not a field kit," Ruiz told Iris, in the clipped voice of someone rationing her own panic. "I can keep him stable another day, maybe two, with what we're carrying. Past that I can't promise anything, and I want that on the record before anybody makes a decision based on me saying he's fine, because he isn't." It was, Iris understood, the sharpest fork in the crossing since the first shot on the corridor. Divert to the nearest Velken medical station, losing the better part of a day they didn't have before the Accord's opening, or press on toward the waypoint and trust Vasquez's condition to hold. Vasquez himself, lucid enough in brief windows to have an opinion, was unambiguous about it. "Don't you dare divert for me," he said, gripping her wrist with less strength than he had on the day of the ambush but no less conviction. "I already handed you this crossing once, Calder. I'm not going to be the reason you don't finish it. Ruiz keeps me stable, you keep moving, and if I'm still breathing when you reach that amphitheater, that's the whole of what I need from anyone." She pressed on, and hated the decision the entire second day, and would keep hating it quietly for longer than she let herself admit. The specific, ugly arithmetic of choosing a treaty over a man's certainty of recovery, dressed up as respecting his wishes, because respecting his wishes was easier to live with than admitting the treaty had simply mattered more. It was in that same stretch, while Ruiz fought to keep Vasquez's fever down and Iris fought to keep her hands steady on the authorization logs, that Officer Kers found her alone at the tailgate of the command vehicle during a fuel stop, and set a data chit on the seat beside her without a word of preamble. My helmet recorder captured the inquiry interview second magistrate Val's staff conducted with me 2 days past regarding the first ambush, Kers said. "It is a routine harmonic transcript. Standard procedure, every garrison officer involved in a Cindral engagement is interviewed, and every interview is recorded for the court record. And ordinarily that record goes nowhere anyone outside the border security office would think to look." Her vents held a careful, deliberate gray, the color Iris was learning Velken wore when they had already decided something, and were past the point of debating it with themselves. Second Magistrate Val asked me, directly, whether I had authorized or observed any irregular routing changes to your convoy. His undervoice at that question did something I have heard perhaps 4 times in 11 years of service, and each of those 4 times, the officer asking the question was lying to me. "You're giving this to me instead of your own chain of command." "I gave a preliminary report to my own chain of command 2 hours after the interview," Kers said, and something in her tone, careful and unhurried as it was, carried an edge Iris hadn't heard from her before. "It has not, as of this morning, produced any visible action. I do not know whether that is because the report is sitting unread in an office too busy to prioritize it, or because it reached someone who has reasons of their own not to prioritize it. I would prefer not to find out which, 3 days from now, standing in front of a first magistrate wondering why nobody flagged this sooner." She looked at Iris directly, faceted eyes steady. "You kept 11 people alive on the corridor with a driver everyone at Senir Hold dismissed as a formality, and you have been building a case with nothing but routing logs and a stubborn refusal to accept the easy version of events since the first hour of this crossing. I have decided that is the kind of person a transcript like this belongs with." Iris took the chit, and did not entirely trust her own voice to thank her properly, and settled for the truth instead. "This might be the piece that actually matters, Kers. Out of everything. Then I hope I am not the only Velken officer on this crossing who has decided that duty to the truth outranks duty to a chain of command that has, twice now, been slow to notice its own convoy nearly got taken apart from the inside. Kers's vents flickered once, into something that might, on a human face, have been the ghost of a grim smile. Senior Hold is not without honest soldiers, Calder. We are simply not always the ones who get asked first. They worked the case together that final night before the waypoint, the way Iris imagined field surgeons worked a difficult casualty. Fast, wordless in long stretches, each of them handling a different piece of the same problem without needing to be told which piece was theirs. Ruiz split her attention between Vasquez's fever chart and the ration crate residue samples Dane had preserved from the poisoning attempt, running a field analysis that confirmed by midnight that the compound matched a formulation used twice before in Cindral sabotage attempts documented in the garrison's own archives. Archives that, Kers pointed out grimly, 2nd Magistrate Val's subcommittee had direct access to and had cited in a report 6 months prior. As evidence for exactly the kind of border threat his Article 9 restrictions were meant to guard against. He didn't invent the poison, Dane said, turning the analysis over in his hands. He knew the archive, knew what would read as authentically Cindral to anyone who checked. That's not the work of a man improvising out of grief, Calder. That's the work of a man who's had this planned for longer than one convoy's crossing. Kers laid the routing credential, the geological survey record, and her own harmonic transcript out on the mess table in a line, the physical arrangement of evidence, a habit Iris recognized from her own training, the instinct to make an argument legible before it had to survive being spoken aloud in front of a hostile room. Alone, any one of these is deniable, Kers said. The routing amendment could be clerical error. The transcript could be a nervous man discussing a subject that reminds him of his brother. The poison's archive match could be coincidence, if you are determined enough to call it one. Together, in front of a first magistrate who already trusts my service record and has no reason yet to trust yours, they are not deniable at all. Then we don't present them alone, Iris said, and felt, for the first time since the ambush, something that wasn't quite confidence but was close enough to stand on. We present them together in the order that makes the pattern impossible to argue with piece by piece. Routing first, so the court sees the mechanism. The archive match second, so they see the planning. The transcript last, because a lie caught in a magistrate's own voice is the one thing in this entire case nobody in that court will be able to explain away as coincidence. Ruiz, looking up from Vasquez's chart long enough to catch the tail end of the plan, allowed herself the first smile Iris had seen from her since the ambush. For what it's worth, she said, the ambassador's fever broke an hour ago. Not fully, he's not out of the woods, but he asked me before he went back under whether you'd found what you needed yet. I told him I didn't know. I think I can tell him yes now. It was past 3 in the morning by the time the case sat fully assembled, cross-referenced, and duplicated across 3 separate data chits in case any single one failed to survive the final approach to the waypoint, and Iris looked around the mess table at the 4 of them. A Terran corpsman, a Velken garrison officer risking her own career on a hunch about the truth, a Deathworld contractor the mission had never once planned to acknowledge as more than a line item, and herself. 25 years old and further from the negotiating table, she'd trained for than she had ever expected to be, and understood that whatever happened at the hollow waypoint tomorrow, none of them had done this crossing alone. Regardless of what the mission's official manifest would eventually record. It reached 2nd Magistrate Val's office 4 hours later, relayed up the garrison chain by an officer who had no idea she was handing a hardliner exactly the weapon he needed. And by the time the convoy rolled into the outskirts of the hollow waypoint that evening, a formal inquiry notice was already waiting for Iris at the mission's forward liaison post. An allegation, filed under 2nd Magistrate Val's own seal, that the Terran delegation had knowingly transported an unregistered Deathworld combat asset into sovereign Velken territory, in direct violation of Article 9, of the very treaty framework they had come to sign. Iris read it standing in a cold stone corridor with Dane beside her, and understood, with a sinking clarity that had nothing to do with the fever now running through half her convoy from the poisoned rations they hadn't quite finished purging, that the man trying to stop the treaty had just found the one weapon capable of destroying her mission from the inside, in a chamber full of Velken officials who would need no further evidence than the footage already spreading through the garrison's own channels. "You should have let Sakash win," Dane said, and it took her a moment to realize it was as close to a joke as she'd ever heard him make. "Don't," Iris said. "This isn't they'll pull you from the mission. They might do worse than that. Article 9 has enforcement teeth. Dane, actual criminal." "I know what Article 9 does. I've read every treaty that's ever tried to write men like me out of existence." He said it without heat, the same flat register he'd used to describe the ambush's timing, and something in the steadiness of it was worse than anger would have been. This was always the cost of the job. Rule 1. The principal doesn't wait on things that don't change the outcome, and my registry status doesn't change whether Thane signs that accord in 2 days. Yours does. So we finish the crossing, and we finish it with you standing in front of that court able to look Val in the eye instead of flinching at him, because flinching is the only thing that actually loses this. She did not sleep at all that final night before the waypoint, not from fear this time but from the particular sharpened wakefulness of a woman assembling a case, cross-referencing the routing credential, Kers's helmet footage, the garrison's geological survey record that proved the rockslide had never happened, and a Velken border security authorization log that traced, however many layers down, back to Orani's Val's own subcommittee, and somewhere past the 3rd hour. Watching Dane clean and recheck a weapon he had already cleaned twice, she understood that whatever happened at the hollow waypoint tomorrow, the two of them had stopped being principal and hired protection sometime on the Ashveil Corridor and become, instead, the only two people in this entire crossing who actually knew the shape of the fight they were walking into. The final ridge before the hollow waypoint climbed for 9 kilometers through quarried switchbacks, where the black stone gave way at last to the pale terrace-cut rock that ringed the amphitheater itself. And it was there, less than 2 hours from the sensor net that would put the convoy under the waypoint's own protection for whatever remained of the crossing, that Commander Vray Sakash made his last move. He did not send trucks against them again, not into open ground, not against a driver who had already shown him twice what open ground cost a man determined to fight on it. Instead, at the single narrowest point of the final ascent, where the roadbed pinched against a sheer rock face with no shoulder wide enough to offer the convoy a second route through, his remaining people had spent the 2 days since the second ambush burying a command-detonated charge under the frost-cracked gravel, and waiting, with the particular patience of men who had already lost the arithmetic of the war and had nothing left to spend on it but timing. Dane called the convoy to stop 900 meters short of the pinch point, for no reason he could put into a sentence faster than the vehicles could roll to a halt, a wrongness in the color of the gravel where it caught the morning light, a stretch of roadbed swept too clean of the loose scree that covered every other meter of this ridge, and he was on foot and 40 meters ahead of the lead vehicle, walking the choke point alone the way he had walked every choke point since Corps Bridge. When Sakash's people triggered the charge early rather than let a cairn-trained instinct walk itself back out of a kill, they had spent 2 days building. The blast took out 11 meters of roadbed and threw a curtain of shattered stone 40 meters into the pale morning sky, and it should have killed him, would have killed almost anyone whose entire life had not been, in its own brutal way, an argument against exactly that math. But Dane was already moving when the charge went, throwing himself sideways into the lee of an outcrop half a second before the leading edge of the debris wave would have caught him square. It cost him a ribbon of shrapnel torn along his upper arm and 2 cracked ribs from the concussion of the blast itself, instead of the far worse accounting the charge had been built to collect. The 2 truckloads Sakash had kept in reserve came down off the ridge above in the same instant, exactly the way Dane had once told Iris, back at the second ambush, that 2 held-back crews would, covering fire meant to finish whatever the charge had started, aimed at a stretch of road where Sakash's people expected to find a convoy stopped dead and disoriented. Not a convoy already braking hard on Dane's called warning with its security detail, already piling out into what cover the roadside offered. Iris fired the weapon Vasquez had pressed into her hands 3 days ago for the second time in her life, and the first time she ever aimed it at another living person instead of the abstract idea of one. And she did not hit anything that mattered, and she kept firing anyway, because the only alternative was putting her head back below the dash and leaving Dane alone on open ground with 2 cracked ribs and a gun crew that had not yet clocked he was down. Some calculation she did not have time to examine had already decided, sometime in the 3 weeks since the Ashveil Corridor, that she was done being the one who stayed hidden, while somebody else paid for her safety in blood. It took 4 minutes this time, not 90 seconds, because Dane fought the last of it from a kneeling position with one arm mostly useless at his side and did it anyway, and when the ridge finally went quiet the 2 trucks lay burning in the gravel below the pinch point. Sakash's own radio traffic, recovered afterward from Kers's intercept logs, carried a single transmission back to whatever remained of the Cindral Vanguard's command net. The road is not open. It was never going to be open. Stand down. It was the last order Commander Vray Sakash gave on the Ashveil Corridor. Whatever grief and stubbornness had kept him fighting a war his own numbers had told him, for weeks now, that he had already lost. 4 minutes on a mountain switchback with 2 trucks left out of the 9 he had brought to the second ambush finally exceeded it. Ruiz reached him before Iris did, cutting away the sleeve of his jacket with hands that had gone entirely steady despite 3 days of near-continuous triage, and pronounced the ribs cracked rather than broken, and the shrapnel wound clean enough to close in the field. And Dane sat through all of it without a sound beyond the flat, controlled breathing Iris was learning to recognize as the specific sound he made instead of screaming. "You are not walking into that amphitheater on cracked ribs without a proper brace," Ruiz said, already wrapping one. "I'm walking into that amphitheater regardless of what's under the brace," Dane said, and when Iris crouched down in front of him, her hands not quite steady on his jaw as she checked his eyes for a concussion Ruiz hadn't gotten to yet, he let her, which she understood, after 3 weeks of watching him decide unilaterally what he would and would not permit to be done to him, as its own kind of answer. "You don't get to almost die for me, and then tell me it doesn't count because you're still standing," she said. "It counts," he said. "It's just not the thing that matters today." His good hand found her wrist briefly, the same economical gesture he'd have used to move her below a dashboard, except there was nothing efficient about it this time at all. Rule 1 still holds, Calder. Whatever this costs, it doesn't change whether Thane signs that accord today. Get me upright. That's all I need from the next hour. The hollow waypoint sat inside a natural amphitheater of black stone worn smooth by 10,000 years of wind, a neutral ground both governments had used for 3 generations of treaties precisely, because it belonged to neither of them. And First Magistrate Orvesa Thane stood at its center on the morning of the Accords, opening in ceremonial robes the color of deep water. Watching the Terran delegation's battered convoy climb the final switchback into the amphitheater's floor, with an expression her own staff had learned, across a decade of her rule, never to try to read from a distance. She was old, by Velken measure, 2 centuries and 11 years, her chitin gone the pale iridescent gray that marked the last third of a Velken life, her undervoice worn to a low, steady hum that decades of court protocol had taught her to hold level through anything. She had signed 4 treaties in her reign. She had buried, in the war before this peace, a daughter who had commanded a border garrison not unlike Senir Hold, and she had spent every year since asking herself whether the daughter she'd buried would have called this accord wisdom or surrender, and had never once arrived at an answer she trusted. "They arrived a full day behind schedule," said the aide at her shoulder, "having survived 2 Cindral engagements and a poisoning attempt, magistrate. And second magistrate Val has formally requested the floor before the accord's opening ceremony to raise a matter of Article 9 compliance regarding the delegation's security contractor. Orenes has requested many things in 11 years of service," Thane said. "Let him have the floor. Let us hear what he believes an unregistered driver's presence proves that 4 survived ambushes and a working treaty draft do not." She watched the young Terran woman, Calder, the file said, junior liaison, promoted mid-crossing when the senior ambassador's injuries took him out of the negotiation entirely. Step down from the lead vehicle with the specific, deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided, consciously, not to let her hands shake in front of a room that is waiting for exactly that. Behind her stood the driver, unremarkable to look at, Thane noted with the particular attention of a woman who had outlived 4 wars, and learned to distrust exactly that kind of unremarkable, and utterly, unnaturally still in a way that made her old soldier's instincts stand up along her spine before he had done anything at all to earn it. A fresh field dressing showed beneath the torn sleeve of his jacket, dark at the edges, and he stood in a way that told her, more plainly than any garrison report could have, exactly how recently and how badly he had been hurt on the road that had gotten this delegation here at all. Second Magistrate Orenes Val called for the floor within the hour, before the accord's opening seal had even been broken, and did it in front of the full assembled court. 40 Velken officials, 3 garrison commanders, the entire Terran delegation, and a gallery of border territory observers who would carry whatever happened here back to their own communities by nightfall. "I do not dispute the courage of this delegation's crossing," Val said, his undervoice pitched with the careful, cultivated evenness of a man who had spent 11 years learning to sound reasonable while arguing for war. He was younger than Thane by nearly a century, his chitin still the deep obsidian of Velken middle life, and he stood with the particular rigidity of a man who had buried someone and built a career out of the grief. "I dispute the wisdom of a peace built on a foundation this delegation itself has already broken. Article 9 of the framework we are here to ratify explicitly bars Deathworld-trained combat personnel from sovereign Velken territory. Garrison footage from 3 days past shows the Terran delegation's own contracted driver engaging and eliminating a Cindral raiding force of considerable size, alone, in a manner no ordinary security contractor is capable of. I have reviewed his registry. It is a Cairn colonial seal, filed under compact logistics rather than compact security. Specifically, I submit to evade the very screening Article 9 requires." He turned, faceted eyes finding Dane across the amphitheater floor with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment. "If this delegation is willing to violate the accord's own terms before its ink is dry, First Magistrate, what confidence can this court have in anything they have promised us?" The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific pressure of 40 officials recalculating, in real time, whether the peace they had gathered to sign was already compromised. And Iris felt it land on her like a physical thing, because Val was not wrong about the facts, only about what the facts meant, and she had exactly one chance to make that distinction land before it was too late to matter. "May I address the floor, First Magistrate?" Iris said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she had any right to expect, and Thane, watching her from the dais with an expression that had not moved once through Val's entire speech, inclined her head a fraction of a degree that Iris understood somehow to mean go on. "Second Magistrate Val is correct that our security contractor is Cairn registered, and correct that his registry was filed under logistics rather than security," Iris said. I won't insult this court by pretending that filing was an accident. It was a workaround, one this mission is not the first to use and will not be the last, because Article 9 as currently written makes it functionally impossible for any compact mission traveling through contested territory to hire the kind of protection that territory actually requires. And every mission before ours has quietly done exactly what we did rather than arrive unprotected and call that principle. She let that sit for one breath, watching several of the garrison commander's vents flicker in something that might have been recognition. But Second Magistrate Val has not asked this court to consider why our convoy needed that protection in the first place. He has asked you to look at the driver instead of the road. I'd like this court to look at the road. She raised the data slate Dane had helped her assemble across 3 sleepless nights. The routing amendment filed 9 hours before the first ambush, rerouting the convoy onto an unlisted spur to avoid a rockslide the garrison's own geological survey confirmed had never occurred. The delegated authorization credential that traced, through 3 layers of routine approval, back to a subcommittee office. And set beside it, a harmonic transcript Officer Cares had quietly provided after the second ambush, recorded from her own helmet unit during the inquiry interview Val's staff had conducted with her 2 days prior, in which Second Magistrate Val's undervoice asked a single direct question about whether he had authorized any routing changes to the Terran convoy, had dropped a full quarter tone into the harmonic register. Every Velken officer was trained from childhood to recognize as the unmistakable signature of a controlled lie. "I am not a soldier and I am not a Velken," Iris said, into a silence that had gone, in the space of that single-held breath, from politely hostile to something closer to riveted. "I cannot read a harmonic drift the way any officer in this room can. But I can read an authorization log, and I can read a timestamp, and both of them trace the routing change that put my convoy directly into Commander Sakash's ambush back to Second Magistrate Val's own subcommittee, filed 9 hours before the attack, countersigned under a delegated credential his office issued, and never revoked. I submit that the reason this court should distrust what happened on the Ashveil Corridor isn't the driver who kept 11 people alive against 9 raider trucks. It's the magistrate who knew exactly which unlisted road to send them down." Val's undervoice, for the first time in the entire proceeding, lost its careful evenness entirely. Not a controlled drop this time, but a genuine, unpracticed spike, audible even without a trained ear. The sound of a man realizing the ground under his rehearsed grief had just given way. And he opened his mouth to answer and found, Iris would understand later, that there was no answer built cleanly enough to survive a harmonic transcript already circulating through 40 officials' own collar feeds in real time. "I lost my brother on that road," Val said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that made the whole court go very still, because it was, Iris realized, the truest thing he had said all morning. "I have spent 9 years watching this accord ask me to call that loss the price of a peace I was never certain would hold. I did not build the Cindral's ambush to kill anyone. I built it to slow this delegation, to give the Border Security Review the time it needed to find real cause to delay ratification, because I believed, and I still believe, that a peace signed too quickly is a peace that fails a second time, worse than the first. You gave a wartime militia the routes and the timing to attack an unarmed diplomatic convoy," First Magistrate Thane said, and her voice, when it finally broke its decade-long stillness, carried a weight that silenced the amphitheater more completely than any shouted accusation could have. "You did this in my name, under my accord, and you let a garrison officer's honest report become the weapon you intended to use against the very peace you claim to be protecting. Whatever grief drove you to it, Oranis, you have handed Commander Sakash's cause more legitimacy in 3 days than 9 years of separatist rhetoric managed on its own, and you have done it by nearly getting a delegation of children and diplomats killed on a road your own brother died defending." She turned, faceted eyes finding Dane across the floor, and something in her ancient, weathered face shifted into an expression Iris had not seen it hold once through the entire proceeding. And you built your case for Article 9 on the actions of the one man in that convoy, whose presence is the only reason there is anyone left standing here for this court to argue about it all. The garrison detail moved on Thane's single raised hand, and Val did not resist them, standing very still in the center of the amphitheater floor with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 9 years building a case for war and discovered, too late, that grief and treason were not, in the end, the same argument no matter how carefully he had tried to make them sound alike. It was not, in the end, a clean ending, because Commander Vray Sakash was still out there with 6 trucks and 30 veterans, and a grievance 9 years deep that a single magistrate's arrest would not undo overnight, and Thane said as much to the assembled court within the hour, her undervoice steady again, the ancient authority of it settling back over the amphitheater like a held breath finally released. This accord does not end the grief that drove Orani's Val to treason, nor the grief that still arms Commander Sakash's men, Thane said. It cannot. No document ends grief. It can only decide what we choose to do with it, going forward, and I choose peace, imperfect and unfinished as it will remain for longer than I have years left to see it through. She looked once more at Dane Marlowe, standing at the edge of the amphitheater floor in the same unremarkable stillness he had carried since the moment Iris first watched him walk into gunfire on the Ashveil Corridor, cracked ribs braced beneath his jacket, a fresh wound dressed and ignored, still standing because standing was the only condition he seemed to consider acceptable while there was a treaty left to see finished. Article 9 will be reviewed before this court ratifies it. Not struck. I am not fool enough to invite an unregulated Deathworld presence into every border garrison in the territory. Reviewed and rewritten, so that men like this one are registered as what they actually are, protected by the law they currently have to break to do the work our own treaties quietly require of them. I will not sign a peace that asks good men to lie about who they are in order to keep the rest of us alive long enough to enjoy it. Iris felt something in her chest unclench that had been wound tight since the first shot on the corridor, and beside her, Dane Marlowe said nothing at all, which she was beginning to understand was, for him, the loudest possible form of relief. The hollow accord was signed 2 hours later, in a ceremony shortened by exhaustion and lengthened by the sheer number of officials who wanted their names formally attached to a peace that had nearly died 3 separate times on the road to this amphitheater. And when it was finally, fully done, sealed, witnessed, transmitted back through both governments' networks in the specific irreversible way that meant it could no longer be quietly unmade by a subcommittee's routing amendment or a raider commander's grief. Iris walked out onto the amphitheater's high rim alone, into wind that smelled of cold stone and distant snow, and found Dane already there, watching the 6 remaining Cindral trucks retreat at last, back toward the northern ridgeline, this time for good. Everybody warned me about Sakash, she said. About the Cindral, about every possible way this crossing could fail because of the enemy we already knew was out there. She looked at him, at the scarring along his knuckles that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, at the flat, unreadable stillness that she now understood wasn't emptiness at all but the particular discipline of a man who had spent his whole life being underestimated on purpose, by people who needed him too much to admit what he actually was. Nobody warned me about you. No, Dane agreed, and for the first time since she'd known him, something at the corner of his mouth moved that might, in a kinder light, have been called a smile. That was always the plan. A driver nobody looks at twice is a driver who can still be standing when everybody who looked away is the reason you need him. That's not going to work anymore. Thane's rewriting Article 9. You're going to be registered, Dane, seen, on the record for what you actually are. Good, he said, and turned to watch the last of the retreating trucks vanish over the ridgeline, his voice as level and unhurried as it had been on the very first morning she'd met him, 3 weeks and one impossible crossing ago, when she had still believed the only danger on this road wore a Cindral Vanguard patch and carried a rifle out in the open where everyone could see it coming. It's about time somebody did. 6 weeks later, the formal registry amendment First Magistrate Thane's office filed with the Compact Joint Treaty Commission ran to 11 pages of technical language that boiled down, in the end, to a single sentence Iris read 4 times before she let herself believe it said what it said. Deathworld-trained combat personnel from registered penal charter colonies could be lawfully contracted for compact security duty within Velken sovereign territory, provided they carried full disclosure of origin and capability on a public service record rather than a logistics line item built specifically to hide them. Cairn Colonial Registry Contractor 4471, Dane Marlowe, on every document that mattered from that day forward, was the first name entered under the new statute, and Iris was in the mission liaison office at Senir Hold the afternoon the confirmation came through, and she made him read the notice twice before she believed he had actually finished the sentence, rather than simply glancing past it the way he glanced past most things written about him. "Feels different seeing it written down?" she asked. "Feels like paperwork," he said, which was, she was coming to understand, as close as he ever came to admitting that something had moved him. Commander Vray Sakash did not surrender in the amphitheater, and did not surrender in the weeks immediately after either, but the handful of trucks and fighters he had left after the ridge scattered inside a month, because a grief that has spent 9 years believing itself the last honest resistance to a rigged peace does not survive discovering that the peace's most implacable-seeming enemy had been rigging the war too, on the other side, the entire time. Kers's report on the Val conspiracy reached every border settlement between Senir Hold and the Ashveil Corridor within a week of the ceremony, translated into every dialect the relief agencies could manage between them, and Yareth of Rennick's Landing was, according to Priya Annan's field notes, the first person in her settlement to say out loud what half the border territories had already begun to suspect: that a war which needed a sitting magistrate to manufacture atrocities in order to keep itself alive had perhaps never carried as much honest grievance, this last decade, as its own commander wanted to believe it did. Sakash himself surrendered to a Senir Hold patrol 11 weeks after the Hollow Accord signing, without ceremony, and without the fight Dan had spent 30 years of border service assuming a man like Sakash would choose instead. He asked only, according to the 3-line message Dan sent Iris afterward, whether the driver who had beaten him twice was still alive. Told that he was, Sakash said nothing further and put down his weapon. Corporal Ash's leg healed clean, after 2 months of unglamorous physical therapy that never made it into any after-action report Iris read, though she made a point of visiting him at the Senir Hold Field Hospital before the mission finally closed the crossing's paperwork out for good, and he told her, with the particular bluntness of a man young enough to still be more embarrassed than proud of having screamed loud enough for an entire convoy to hear it, that he meant to put in for transfer to whatever unit the Compact eventually built around men like Dane, once Article 9's rewrite gave that unit an actual name to put on a roster. "Rather scream once on a road where somebody wins," he said, "than never scream at all on one where nobody does." Iris didn't have an answer worth giving him, so she shook his hand instead and let that be enough. Ambassador Vasquez recovered fully enough, after 3 weeks in a compact medical frigate surgical suite, to return to the Terran Relief and Accord Mission's senior staff, though he ceded the border territory portfolio to Iris without being asked twice, telling the review board convened to formalize her promotion that he had handed her one crossing under duress, and intended to hand her the rest of his unfinished business on purpose. Kers made captain within the year, over the quiet objection of 2 officers on Senir Hold's promotion board who had also, Iris later learned, sat on the board that had let her first report on Val's irregular routing amendment go unread for 2 critical days. Iris wrote the commendation herself, unprompted, because she had decided somewhere on the Ashveil Corridor that the people who told the truth when it was inconvenient deserved better than a system that only rewarded them after somebody else had nearly died proving them right. She wrote to her uncle, too, the one who had told her, at 21, that a career spent across a table from the people whose war had taken her mother was walking straight back into the fire that killed her. She did not tell him everything, not the crawl space, not the ridge, not the particular shape of the fear she had carried through all 3 weeks of the crossing. She told him only that the hollow accord had held, that the border territories had gone 6 weeks without a single new grave, and that she had finally stopped needing him to be wrong about the fire in order to have gone and stood in it anyway. Dane stayed. The mission's logistics office tried, from old habit, to refile his continued contract under the same line item that had hidden him and 4 generations of cairn contractors before him, and Iris walked the paperwork back to the procurement desk herself and made them redo it under his actual registered designation. And if anyone in that office thought it strange that the mission's newest senior liaison insisted personally on a driver's paperwork, nobody said so twice. "Everybody warned me about the enemy," Iris said again, months later on a different road, watching him check a different vehicle's undercarriage with the same unhurried thoroughness he checked everything else in his life. "Nobody warned me I'd end up depending on the bodyguard more than the treaty." "Rule 1, Dane said, not looking up. "The principle doesn't wait on things that don't change the outcome. And this does." He straightened and looked at her the way he had looked at her exactly once before, on the rim above the hollow waypoint with nothing performed in it at all. "Yeah," he said, "this does."